Morning. I'm State Representative Tony Jurgens. We're here today to discuss disaster relief. Minnesota's Disaster Assistance Contingency account was created in 2014 to respond to natural disasters. Last year, in a year that did not see record snowfall, with just 2 floods in Brainerd and Duluth, $11 million was allocated, draining the account that sits nearly empty today. With record snowfall across the state in the month of February and another round just this weekend, we're poised to see major flooding throughout the state this spring. We need an immediate infusion of funds into the Disaster Assistance Contingency account to ensure the state of Minnesota can appropriately respond to communities struggling with floodwaters as the temperatures begin to rise. Since 2015, approximately $50 million has been allocated from the fund to respond to natural disasters. My bill would allocate $20 million into this account in 2019 and another $20 million in 2020. Funding could be critical in receiving federal assistance under FEMA's Public Assistance Program. This funding is too important to be left until the end of session. It may need to be available next month, or May or June, and we don't want this money getting lost in the shuffle as funding priorities are being decided in omnibus budget bills. Emergency funding should not be tied to other issues. I'd like to recognize Representative Gene Pawlowski, who's here, whose bill it was that created this account in 2014.
Bills are actually 2.
Bills.
2008 and 2014.
Thank you for doing that. Next, our Senate author is Senator Mark Johnson, who has to get back to the Senate floor, so we'll let him speak next.
Well, thank you, Representative. The Senate is under call, so I'll make this very quick, but I am very proud to be carrying the Senate side of this bill. You know, yesterday I went through chest-deep snow to get down close to the Red Lake River, which is right behind my house, and right to the left of that is the Red River, which we all know back in 1997 we had catastrophic flooding up in northwest Minnesota. And right now with the snowpack, I'm concerned, very concerned that that's going to be happening. I want to make sure that we have the funds available to deal with things that may come down the line. Now, this is the snowiest winter we've had in 22 years. Back in 1997 was the last time, and that was the year of the flood. So I'm very happy to be carrying this forward, and I hope that this gets done in time for the end of March, early April flooding season, when those funds are necessary and much needed. So thank you for your time, and I will turn it over to the others for questions. I've got to run upstairs. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Representative Tony Albright. I serve the good people of 55B, which includes Prior Lake and Jordan. And I was looking through the paper from just this past Saturday, and there was a local article in there talking about this very subject, and we were the subject of a news TV report last week. But I'll just refer to a couple of things in here that, you know, make this bill even more imperative, I think, for Prior Lake. And I do want to also thank Representative Pawlowski. He and I went through a fairly arduous process back in 2014 getting monies appropriated for, as you can recall, the flooding that occurred in Prior Lake as well then. There was a study done not too long ago by the federal hydrologist, the U.S. Department of Army Corps of Engineers, that said that all the factors in place, all the factors are in place for Minnesota River to overflow its banks. They cite such things as a wet autumn in 2018 that left soil moisture above normal before the ground froze. Snowpack or water level in the snow is above or significantly above normal across the state. I think I heard Laura Betker from KARE 11 just cite the fact that the amount of snow, if it were converted into rain right now, would fill Mille Lacs 4 times over. That water's got to go someplace. And so our concern is we have to be prepared for how it will affect our communities as it makes its way down to the Gulf. Also, there is a 2 to 4 foot frost depth over the region, which can hamper water from soaking into the ground. Now, this data was taken from February 27th, and I understand there's another one that's coming out shortly. But folks, this is imperative. This is it's not a perennial issue. This is an issue of enormous proportions that could affect Jordan, Prior Lake, all those along the upper Red River, as well as the Minnesota River, Mississippi. We need to prepare for it as opposed to getting behind it and then having to recover. So with that, I am in wholehearted support of the Jurgens bill. I'm a co-author on it. I hope that this gets good press coverage, because this is something that affects not just the political atmosphere around here, but this is good business for the state of Minnesota and the people that call it home. Thank you. With that, I'm going to introduce Fred Corrigan, who oddly enough happens to be the president of the Prior Lake Spring Lake Watershed. So thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Representative Albright. Again, my name is Fred Corrigan. I'm the current president of the Prior Lake Spring Lake Watershed Board of Managers, and we appreciate Representative Jurgens' legislation today. It is very timely, and I think the experience we had in 2014, the Prior Lake Spring Lake Watershed District is about 42 square miles. And it is very dependent on an outlet channel that runs from Prior Lake down through Shakopee into the Minnesota River. We had $1 million worth of damage done to that outlet channel in 2014. Our watershed district has a levy of $1.8 million. So timing is really critical, and we are so grateful to the legislators for considering this bill, because one of the things we ran into, we are just completing $1 million worth of repairs. There's a $750,000 contract that is currently being done 5 years after that flood. We are so fortunate we didn't have another flood event in those 5 years. Otherwise, that channel wouldn't have been able to hold it. Currently, funding for districts like ours and local communities is about 90% federal from FEMA and 10% from the state. But those funds are not available until the project is complete. They have to be approved by those agencies, and that's taken us almost 5 years to get those projects approved and contracts let. So timing is critical. There's no dollars available. To know that there's some funding available at the state is critical to water districts like ours, the Red River Valley, and other local communities around the state who had damage far beyond ours to local roads and infrastructure. Thank you.
You know, my district is District 54B, and we're bound on the west by the Mississippi River and the east, the St. Croix River. So this is something that really has our attention in my district because of the potential flooding that we could see this spring, and that's why this needs immediate attention. You know, yesterday didn't get as much snow as what they had called for, but I still had 5 or 6 inches at my house, and went up and down the block with a snowblower clearing driveways for neighbors, and when I started it was still snowing, but by the time I got done it was melting. So that's one thing that we know for sure, although at times it maybe didn't feel like it, but spring is coming, and that snow, that record amount of snowfall is going to melt, and it has to go somewhere. At some point, if it doesn't melt right, we're going to see the creeks overflowing, the lakes overflowing, the ponds overflowing, and the river's overflowing. So we need to fund this account. We need to properly fund it. We would rather have more money in there than we need and not need it than to have not enough money in there and wish we had more. So with that, we also have Representative Greg Bowe from Chaska, Representative Barb Haley from Red Wing, if they want to say a few words, or if not, we can feel free. Otherwise, we'll take questions too. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Barb Haley, District 21A. And I just want to speak briefly in support to thank Representative Pawlowski for his vision a number of years ago to create the fund, and Representative Jurgens for being proactive. This is really important in state government, that we are thinking ahead and protecting our communities and our citizens. My district is where all the water comes from in northern Minnesota. From me to Representative Pawlowski's area, Red Wing, Lake City, Wabasha. We get a little bit of flooding every year, but what we've had in snowfall this year, the projections are scary, quite frankly, for the amount of water that's coming our way. So I urge support of this so that we can be on top of it. As Representative Jurgens said, we need to get the money there now. because spring is on its way. Thank you. Thanks for the attention to the bill this morning.
Thank you. Representative Greg Bowe, District 47B, which is Chaska, Chanhassen, and Victoria, also in the Minnesota River Valley. It's interesting to note that the weather conditions for this year are really quite aligned well with 1965. And that's a year that featured a lot of record-setting flooding up and down the Minnesota River Valley. We had a lot of moisture in the fall, so the soil is saturated. We had a good solid freeze because we didn't have a lot of snow, so the frost went very deep. Now we have a very moisture-laden, heavy snowpack. And now we're looking at a forecast of a fair amount of rain over the next week or so. And so the conditions could, I think, deteriorate very quickly. And so I'm in full support of this bill, and I thank everyone for their efforts, past and present, to help us be prepared for what's coming. Thank you.
Questions?
Does this money generally go to cities and municipalities to replace or to help repair infrastructure damage, or does it go to individuals?
Yeah, it goes to any local government, state government agency that applies for the disaster assistance.
I want to make a point of clarification here as the author of the bill. You're dealing with Chapter 12A that was created in 2014. This contingency fund was created primarily when we are not in session to avoid a special session. We have had 2.5 hearings in the Greater Minnesota Committee this year, the last one Wednesday, to do exactly what you're doing, to anticipate how much we need to put into the fund, because when we are out of session, we are going to need to have a set of protocols if there is a presidential declaration or a gubernatorial declaration. So I want to make it clear to everybody here today, we're in session. Should a disaster hit now, you would not use this fund. We would appropriate money because we're in session. If we were not in session, this fund, assuming there is a declaration by the president or a declaration by the governor, would then set protocols in place so that we could immediately get help without a special session. And I want to repeat, there is nothing special about a special session. We have had issues with special sessions, and in 2014 and 15, Representative Albright's correct. We put 12B in place, and there was an anomaly, and we're still tweaking this. And it happened in his district, and then we made sure we made a correction when we were in session. So for everybody here, this account does not pay for a disaster. This account sets up a series of protocols for payments so we can get direct aid to people, and then launch 13 state agencies, all the local units of government, and everybody can get aid to these people or these units of government as quickly as possible. So I applaud your efforts, because last Wednesday, we went through the same thing in the Greater Minnesota Committee. And I would hope, because this fund was underfunded the last 4 years, and I'm not going to say who is in charge, but we're hoping this year that we will put in place a fund that will avoid special sessions, and we can get aid to these people as quickly as possible.
It's a great point, because we can't control what's going to happen in June, July, or August, whether there's straight line winds, tornadoes, or floods, or any other disaster. So we need to make sure that this is properly funded now. Any other questions?
But if you fund it now through this bill, then I'm not clear now. Will the money then be available for locals to request at that time, given these floods?
No, the contingency fund is set up when there is a gubernatorial disaster or a presidential disaster. We're in session. We can appropriate money if it is needed, and we should. Now, the protocols could be used to determine how much money, and that's the key issue here. Remember, my area of the state, southeastern Minnesota, still has the largest disaster in the history of this state in 2007, $256 million. There was no special session called. In fact, the people of that area had to beg for a special session. 2014 12B was put in place primarily to say no one in this state is ever going to beg for help again when we have any type of a disaster which the local units of government or their personal finances cannot address.
So as an example, in 2014, because of the rain events that occurred over the course of probably 6 or 7 days in Prior Lake, That happened in June. So to Representative Pawlowski's example, that's why this bill is so imperative, because it isn't about what happens while we're in session. But 12B and 12A in coordination occur because of what happens when we're out of session to avoid a special session. And when you call a special session, usually there are agreements in terms of what can occur or can occur in that session. And so as to Representative Jurgens' point, we don't want this money to be held up and held hostage for the people that are suffering. So we want to fund the account now in an appropriate manner to anticipate events like happened in June of 2014, where I was up to my waist in water trying to help people get groceries to their homes along some of the boulevards that were underwater for literally months. So this is an important step forward that anticipates, not responding currently while we're in session, but anticipates what might happen not only with the floodwaters and what's going to happen if we have, let's say, just say for the sake of speculation, we have a continuation of winter through April, which has been, you know, a fairly common occurrence. Then you run into May and the melt starts running off. We wouldn't know possibly what the accumulated amount of damage is into June when we're out of session. So this affords us the opportunity to anticipate it without us having come back and do the job that we should have done now.
Representative Pawlowski's bill in the governor's budget called for $10 million in fiscal 2019, if I'm not mistaken. Are you satisfied that $10 million is enough?
The 10 million does backfill. This is my earlier point. This fund was underfunded for the last 4 years. It is now got only $100,000 in it, and they had to do a shift inside the department in order to take care of, remember the last disaster that Dayton declared at Hoka? This was this fall. That pretty much drained it. So this does not pay for disasters. It sets up a protocol. We get the bill during session. And the first time it was used in 2014, we got the bill in 2015, and I think Representative Knobloch carried it. If I remember right, it was House File 164. Yes. And it's a much bigger bill than 20 million. Mm-hmm. But this sets up the protocol for those types of things to be addressed to us, because now we know how much it cost. So my hearings in the Greater Minnesota Committee over the last 3 weeks have been to decide that we're going to, first of all, repay the account that's been drained. Then we're looking at least 20 million to make sure we're ready for what happens when we adjourn in May.
Is there any opposition to this bill and the funding?
People are tripping over themselves to help us, and I'm glad they are.
Is the water hazard the biggest part of your sweater?
It's very appropriate now, though. Island green.
So is there any like alarm mechanism in this bill that tells you when you're out or alerts you when the funds are depleted?
The 12A was created when there's a presidential declaration. It immediately sets in a series of protocols. In 2012, the legislative auditor reviewed 12A and said, we have had so many disasters that were not presidential and yet could not be funded by local units of government that we need something else. And we also need a disaster account to ensure that when we're not in session and the governor makes that declaration, that all of these protocols can start. For instance, removal of waste. People like to be paid for removal of waste. You can't just let it accumulate. So certain bills are going to be paid up front right away. And if you've got a water issue, for instance, your wells, if you have a sewer issue, then those things have to be addressed right away.
I think it also speaks to the fact that the necessity for it was back to 2014. It was a teachable moment for a lot of us in terms of seeing what happened, and then what we had to do is identify how to put the bill together, because in past cases, we knew what it was, and we assessed the damage, and we put it together. Floods are an amazingly different animal from the perspective of you really don't know the full extent of the damage until the water recedes. And in Prior Lake's case, that water didn't recede until well into the summer. And so we didn't have those numbers until into the fall. That's why we took it up as one of the first bills when we came back into session in 2015. This is setting us up to avail the municipalities for access to those funds and the proper sequencing, 12A and 12B, depending upon what happens first or if at all, with money that's in the account rather than coming back to the legislature, if not in a special session, one of the first bills out of the gate when we come back in the subsequent year, and have to backfill. We're setting the precedent that we know it's a very likely possibility that people are going to be harmed. We want to be prepared for it in advance.
So this year, if river flooding happens before May 20th, the bill would come to the legislature still in session. If it happens after May 20th, the bill would go to this contingency fund.
Correct.
Okay.
So I'm sensing that there isn't much difference between you, Representative Pulaski, and the rest of you on this then. At first, I thought that there might be.
The only issue here is
He's better
this
looking.
fund has to be
Better sweater.
stable to avoid a special session. Our problem with special sessions have been this. We tend to throw money at everything, and we throw it badly. The special session in 2007 was the poster child of how not to address a disaster. I was the one that had to carry that bill all day, and when we got done, we had cobbled together a bill that addressed every disaster for the last 50 years, except for the one in front of us, because we had no tools. And then 2 weeks after that, I made sure we created 12A to make sure we would never be in this situation again, and that we need to know how to help people and then how to best use state resources. That's the other part of it. I think the review by the legislative auditor that was done in 2012 was a good one. He said 12A was good, but it wasn't enough. We needed 12B, and we needed a disaster account.
And so the floods of 2014 in my area, as well as others, really prompted us to put 12B in place because of the coordination, not only between state agencies, but in that case, it was because of the federal agencies that were incumbent upon bringing their resources to bear on the problem as well. So that's why 12B was so important to put in place.
We've got, FEMA's in charge of this, but once FEMA kicks in, they have certain protocols, and then these two chapters of law were built to work in conjunction with FEMA. When Representative Albright had his issue, it was something we hadn't anticipated. Every disaster now is almost something we haven't anticipated. So I see tweaking 12A and 12B almost indefinitely, because these disasters are coming at us, and we can't anticipate what they are or the type of help we have to give.
So just to make sure that I'm also clear on another point. So Representative Pulaski, your bill currently has 10 million in it to backfill the fund, but it sounds like you're open to or planning to add more to it for going forward?
We've already had 2 hearings in Greater Minnesota. I have an amendment drafted to make sure we're going to do what I hope the governor will recommend on the 15th, which is another 20 million. And if we need to put more in, we'll put more in. And that's what the Greater Minnesota Committee was all about, making sure we address things in Greater Minnesota. And most of these disasters have happened in Greater Minnesota.
Who controls the purse strings? Is the DPS? Are they the ones that dispense the money?
Yes. This goes through DPS.
But also Homeland Security, and then also operating under federal protocols. So this is a rather complicated system. And then the agencies that are involved in Minnesota, I mean, once this thing starts, it does work like clockwork. But it took 7 years to put it together.
Is it just for flooding disasters, or is that?
No.
Any natural disaster.
So it could be tornado, it could be fire, it could be locusts, who knows?
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.